Tyler Jameson had no idea that stealing 10 feet of my land would cost him $7.5 million. My name's Bob Mitchell, and I've been living on Willow Creek Road for 15 years now. Bought the place after my divorce, when I needed somewhere quiet to think and maybe work on my old Ford without Linda complaining about the oil stains. 3 acres of mixed woodland and wetland in Beaverton, nothing fancy, but it backed up to protected creek habitat that connected to the Tualatin River system. The trouble started when Tyler moved in next door. I was replacing rotted deck boards when I heard the moving trucks. Big ones, the kind they use when someone's got more money than sense. The old Henderson place had been empty for 6 months after Mrs. Henderson passed, and I'd gotten used to the peace and quiet. Tyler introduced himself the next day, walking over with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Young guy, maybe 33, wearing designer jeans and a smile that came too easy. "Bob Mitchell," I said, wiping sawdust off my hands before shaking his. "Tyler Jameson, my wife Madison and I just moved in. We're excited to be neighbors." He gestured toward his property where I could see crews already marking out construction zones. "We're planning some updates. Hope we won't be too much trouble." "Depends on what kind of updates." Tyler laughed like I'd made a joke. "Nothing too crazy. Just bringing things up to modern standards." What Tyler called modern standards turned out to be tearing down the old Henderson farmhouse and building something that looked like it belonged in a tech billionaire magazine. Over the next 2 years, I watched them put up a $7.5 million mansion with more glass than a greenhouse and enough outdoor lighting to confuse migrating birds. The construction noise started at 7 every morning and didn't quit until dark. My driveway got blocked twice by delivery trucks. Their workers dumped concrete washout in my drainage ditch. I mentioned it to Tyler a couple times. He always apologized and said he'd talk to the contractors, but nothing changed. The guy was testing me, seeing how much I'd take before I pushed back. The fence went up while I was at Cannon Beach with Tank Rodriguez and a couple other guys from my old Marine unit. We do it every few months, rent a cabin, drink beer, catch steelhead, and complain about how everything's gone to hell since we were young. I came home Sunday evening to find 8 feet of black steel fencing running along what used to be our property line. Except it wasn't on the property line. It was 10 feet into my land, cutting through the natural buffer zone that ran from the road back to Willow Creek. Tyler was in his backyard Monday morning, showing off his new fence to someone in an expensive suit, probably his lawyer or financial advisor. They were laughing about something. I walked over, survey map in hand. "Morning, Tyler. We need to talk about this fence." He turned around, still grinning. "Bob, what do you think? Really defines the property lines, doesn't it?" "It's on my property." His smile didn't change. I had it surveyed. "It's exactly where it should be." I unfolded my survey map, the one I'd gotten when I bought the place. "This says different." Tyler glanced at the paper like it was yesterday's sports scores. "That's an old survey. I used the best surveying company in Portland. Licensed professionals." "Property lines don't change, Tyler. They're fixed by legal description." The guy in the suit stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm sure we can work something out here." My client acted in good faith based on professional survey work. "Your client built a fence on my land without asking." Tyler's smile finally faded. "Look, Bob, I understand you're upset, but let's be practical. It's just a few feet of weeds. Nobody's using it for anything. I'm actually improving the neighborhood property values. Those weeds are part of a protected wetland buffer." He laughed. "Wetland? It's a drainage ditch with some grass around it." I looked past him at his mansion, then back at the fence cutting through what used to be the natural buffer zone between our properties. Something cold settled in my chest. Tyler had no idea what he'd just done. See, I wasn't just any neighbor getting pissed about a property dispute. I'd spent 22 years as an environmental consultant, working on impact assessments for everything from shopping centers to housing developments. I knew every wetland regulation in Oregon like the back of my hand, every setback requirement, every permit needed for construction near sensitive areas. And what I was looking at made my stomach turn, but not for the reasons Tyler thought. That strip of weeds he was talking about was a natural wetland buffer that had been there for decades. The original survey from when I bought my place clearly marked it as part of my property. But more importantly, it was part of a protected habitat area that extended down to the creek running behind both our houses. "Tyler," I said, keeping my voice level, "that fence needs to move back to the actual property line." The fence stays where it is, he said, crossing his arms. I've got the best lawyers in Portland. This fence isn't going anywhere. I folded up my survey map. We'll see. That afternoon, Tyler made his first real mistake. He called around the neighborhood, telling people I was causing problems over some imaginary property dispute. Painted me as the difficult neighbor who couldn't accept that the area was improving. By evening, I'd gotten calls from 3 neighbors asking what was going on. Dorothy from 2 houses down even stopped by. Bob, honey, I heard you and Tyler are having some kind of disagreement. He moved his fence onto my property. Well, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. He seems like such a nice man. His wife brought me cookies when my husband was in the hospital last month. After she left, I realized what Tyler was doing. He was isolating me, making it seem like I was the unreasonable one in a neighborhood where most people barely knew their property lines and just wanted to get along. But Tyler had made one crucial error. He'd pushed me hard enough that I wasn't thinking about being neighborly anymore. I was thinking like an environmental consultant who just witnessed a potential violation of state law. That evening, I sat on my deck with a beer and really looked at Tyler's property for the first time since construction finished. The mansion itself was impressive, but from my angle, I could see how close he'd built to the creek. Too close, maybe. I went inside and pulled out my laptop. As a licensed environmental consultant, I had access to detailed databases that most people never saw. I logged into the state environmental record system and pulled up every document related to Tyler's property development. What I found made me sit back and whistle low. According to state records, the creek behind our properties was classified as critical salmon habitat. Coho and Chinook used this stretch for spawning, and the entire watershed was protected under the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's Habitat Conservation Program. The wetland buffer zone extended 30 feet from the high water mark on both sides. Tyler's fence now cut directly through protected habitat that had been undisturbed for decades. But that wasn't the worst part. I pulled up the original environmental impact assessment that had been required for Tyler's construction permits. The report flagged multiple concerns. The proposed building site was within 50 feet of the creek, which required special mitigation measures. The report specifically mentioned that any permanent structures needed to maintain the 30-foot buffer zone from the high water mark. Most importantly, the final approval was conditional on a post-construction environmental compliance review that was supposed to happen within 6 months of completion. The house had been finished 14 months ago. No compliance review had ever been conducted. I kept digging. The original site plan showed the house positioned to maintain all required setbacks, but when I pulled up recent satellite imagery, I could see something different. The actual building footprint was at least 20 feet closer to the creek than the approved plans indicated. I pulled up the wetland delineation report that had been required for the permits. The protected area was clearly marked with GPS coordinates and detailed boundary descriptions. According to the survey, the wetland buffer started exactly where Tyler's new fence now stood. His fence wasn't just crossing into my property. It was marking the beginning of protected habitat that his house had been built right through. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter Sarah. "Dad, heard you're having neighbor trouble. Everything okay?" I stared at the message, wondering how word had already reached San Antonio. Then I realized Tyler probably had social media, probably posted about his difficult neighbor online. I spent the next hour documenting everything I'd found. Screenshots of the satellite imagery, copies of the permit conditions, photos of the fence location with GPS coordinates. If Tyler wanted to play hardball, I had ammunition he didn't know existed. But before I made any moves, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I called Mike Tank Rodriguez, my old Marine buddy who now worked for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. "Tank, it's Bob. I need to ask you something off the record. What's up?" Hypothetically, if someone built a house in violation of wetland setback requirements and there was never a post-construction compliance review, what would happen if DEQ found out? Hypothetically, they'd be in deep shit. We take wetland violations seriously, especially in critical salmon habitat. Could be looking at restoration orders, heavy fines, even criminal charges if it was willful. What kind of restoration orders? Depends on the severity. Worst case scenario, they'd have to remove whatever structures were built in the protected zone and restore the habitat to its original condition. Even if it was a house? Even if it was a house. We've ordered demolitions before. Not often, but when someone blatantly ignores environmental law, we don't mess around. After I hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen. Tyler's $7.5 million dream house might be sitting in the middle of a protected wetland. The fence was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, I walked over to Tyler's house around 9. He answered the door in workout clothes, probably heading to his home gym. "Bob, what brings you by so early?" "That fence. I need you to move it back to the actual property line." His smile faded. "I told you yesterday that fence isn't moving. I had it professionally surveyed. Your fence crosses into a 30-foot buffer zone that's been protected since the creek was designated critical salmon habitat." "That's a state violation." For the first time, Tyler looked uncertain, but it only lasted a second. "You're bluffing," he said. "I have all the permits." Everything was approved by the county. If there were environmental issues, they would have told me. Maybe they did and you ignored them. His eyes narrowed. "You threatening me?" "I'm explaining the situation." "No, you're trying to intimidate me because you're jealous of what I've built here." "Well, guess what? I didn't get where I am by backing down from bitter old men who can't handle progress." He stepped closer. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to accept that the fence stays where it is, or I'm going to make your life very difficult. I've got lawyers, I've got money, and I've got connections. You want to fight me over 10 feet of mud? Bring it on." That afternoon, Tyler made good on his threat. A certified letter arrived from his attorney claiming I was harassing his client and threatening frivolous litigation. But that wasn't the worst part. By evening, I'd gotten a call from Detective Williams with the Washington County Sheriff. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand you've been having some kind of dispute with your neighbor." "What kind of dispute?" "Mr. Jameson called this afternoon. Says you've been threatening him and his family over a fence. Wanted us to know in case things escalate." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling like I'd been sucker punched. Tyler had played this perfectly. He'd stolen my land, isolated me from the neighbors, and now had the police thinking I was some kind of threat. But he'd made one mistake. He'd pushed me past the point where I cared about being neighborly. I opened my laptop and started preparing a comprehensive report. This wasn't about the fence anymore. This was about 20 years of environmental consulting experience, telling me that Tyler had built his mansion in flagrant violation of state environmental law. The next morning, I called the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality Enforcement hotline at 8 sharp. "DEQ Enforcement, this is Janet. This is Bob Mitchell, licensed environmental consultant. I need to report a potential wetland violation in critical salmon habitat. Hold for compliance, supervisor." A minute later, "This is Director Walsh. What do you have?" "A residential structure that appears to have been built in violation of wetland setback requirements, plus a new fence that's been placed directly across protected habitat buffer zone." I gave him Tyler's address and my consultant license number. "I can provide GPS coordinates, satellite imagery, and copies of the original permits that show the violations. Send everything to my email. We'll have someone out there within 48 hours. I spent the morning preparing the most comprehensive environmental violation report of my career. Satellite photos showing Tyler's house position versus the approved site plan. Survey maps with the wetland boundaries clearly marked. Photos of the fence cutting through the buffer zone. The original environmental impact assessment with all its unmet conditions. But I also included something else. The enforcement history for similar violations, cases where DEQ had ordered partial or complete demolition of structures built in protected areas, the legal precedents that showed they didn't make exceptions for expensive houses or wealthy owners. While I was working, I watched Tyler through my office window. He was in his backyard showing off the fence to someone, probably another neighbor, spreading his version of the story. Around noon, my daughter called. "Dad, I've been thinking about your neighbor situation. Maybe you should just let the fence thing go. I know it's the principle, but is it worth all the stress?" "I'm handling it properly," I told her, the same words I'd used with Tyler 2 days ago. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to let the appropriate authorities sort this out." After we hung up, I finished my report and sent it to Director Walsh. Then I waited. That evening, Tyler came to my door. Different approach this time. Friendly smile, bottle of wine in his hand. "Bob, I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I know you're upset about the fence and I want to work something out." "What kind of something?" "I'll pay you for the 10 feet. Fair market value, plus a little extra for the inconvenience. We can get it appraised, make it official. The fence needs to move. His smile tightened. The fence is staying where it is, but I'm willing to compensate you fairly for the land use. It's not about money. Everything's about money, Bob. How much? 10,000? 20? I looked at him standing on my porch with his expensive wine and condescending smile, offering to buy his way out of stealing my property. He had no idea what was coming. There's no amount, I said. There's always an amount. Good night, Tyler. I closed the door and watched through the window as he stood there for a moment, probably trying to figure out what had just happened. He tried threats, then isolation, now bribery. None of it had worked, and he couldn't understand why. Tomorrow, the state environmental inspectors would arrive, and Tyler would learn that some problems couldn't be solved with money or lawyers or social media campaigns. The DEQ inspectors arrived at 9 Thursday morning in a white pickup truck with state government plates. 2 people, Director Walsh and a younger woman with surveying equipment. I watched from my kitchen window as they parked in front of Tyler's house. Tyler answered the door in his business casual outfit, probably thinking they were there about some routine permit issue. I saw him gesture toward his property, confident and relaxed. Then Walsh showed him something on a clipboard, and Tyler's whole posture changed. The inspection took 6 hours. They walked the entire property with GPS units, took photos of the house's position relative to the creek, and spent a long time examining the fence line where it crossed into the wetland buffer. They also brought out core sampling equipment and took soil samples from multiple locations. Around 2 in the afternoon, they came to my door. Mr. Mitchell, Director Walsh, DEQ. Thank you for the report. We need to verify some boundary information with you. I walked them around my property, showing them the original survey stakes and explaining how the fence had been moved. The younger inspector, introduced as Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Wetland Compliance Division, took GPS readings at multiple points along the fence line. This fence is definitely in the protected buffer zone, she told Walsh. And based on our measurements, the house itself is at least 20 feet closer to the creek than the approved site plan shows. Dr. Martinez pulled out a tablet and showed Walsh something on the screen. The soil samples confirm wetland hydrology. Hydric soils, wetland vegetation indicators, everything points to this being active salmon habitat. Walsh nodded grimly. We'll have the full report completed by tomorrow, but this looks like a clear violation of the Oregon Forest Practices Act and the state removal fill law. That afternoon, a certified letter was delivered to Tyler's house. I watched him sign for it, open it on his front steps, and then sit down heavily on his porch stairs. He sat there for almost an hour, just staring at the letter. Around 5, Tyler came to my door again. This time he looked different. Pale, shaken. Bob, I need to ask you something. What's that? Did you call the state about my house? I met his eyes. I reported a fence that was built illegally in protected wetland habitat. They're saying I have to tear down the house. I wouldn't know anything about that. The whole house, Bob. They're saying the entire structure is in violation of environmental law and has to be demolished. His voice cracked. $7.5 million. The demolition order came down 8 weeks later. DEQ's final report concluded that Tyler's house had been built in willful violation of wetland setback requirements, that the required post-construction compliance review had been deliberately avoided, and that the fence represented continued encroachment into critical salmon habitat. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife joined the enforcement action, citing violations of the state's Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the Native Fish Conservation Policy. The state gave Tyler 90 days to restore the property to its natural condition, complete demolition of all structures within the protected zone, removal of all non-native landscaping, and replanting with native vegetation approved by the Oregon Biodiversity Information Center. Tyler hired 4 different law firms to fight the order. He appealed to the county, the State Environmental Board, and finally to federal court under the Clean Water Act. Every appeal was denied. The law was clear, the violations were documented, and the satellite imagery proved everything had been built contrary to the approved plans. The demolition began on a Tuesday morning in October. I watched from my deck as the excavators rolled up Tyler's driveway. The fence came down first, 20 minutes of work to remove what had started this whole mess. Then they began dismantling the $7.5 million house piece by piece. Tyler and his family had moved out the week before. I heard they were renting a place in Lake Oswego while he tried to sell his cryptocurrency company to cover the restoration costs and environmental fines. The total bill was approaching $9 million. The neighbors stopped calling me the difficult one after the news reports started running. Local tech CEO faces $1 million fine for environmental violations was the headline in the Oregonian. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about wetland protection and buffer zones. Mrs. Henderson's daughter called me the day after demolition finished. "I heard what happened to that awful man," she said. "Mom always worried he didn't respect the land like Dad did." 8 months later, my property was quiet again. The land where Tyler's house had stood was planted with native grasses, red alder, and young Douglas fir trees. Willow Creek ran clear, and I'd started seeing coho salmon in the shallow areas again for the first time in years. Sometimes I walked down to where the fence used to be and remembered Tyler's laugh, his certainty that money and lawyers could solve any problem. He'd learned the hard way that some laws exist for reasons bigger than property values or personal convenience. The environmental fines and legal costs had forced him to declare bankruptcy. His company was sold to cover debts, and last I heard, he was working for someone else again, back to being an employee instead of an empire builder. Standing in the restored wetland buffer, watching the water flow toward the Tualatin River, I thought about how one phone call had changed everything. Not because I was angry or vengeful, but because I knew that protecting critical salmon habitat meant following the law, even when it cost $7.5 million to tear down the evidence of breaking it. The salmon were coming home. That's what mattered. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel,